Hello, everyone. This is Trip, and you're listening to Homebrewed Christianity, where since the year of 2008, I've been bringing you interviews with scholars, philosophers, theologians, and doing it again today right here on the podcast. I'm talking to Helen Bond. She is the professor of Christian origins, the head of school here at the University of Edinburgh, where I am, and we're talking about her newest book, The First Biography of Jesus, Genre and Meaning in Mark's Gospel. Helen is not only an excellent professor, she is a ton of fun. You're going to say to yourself when you hear this, you're like, whoa, Trip, it's not fair that a brilliant scholar is also so articulate and fun. Like, whoa, what is up with that? And I'll say, yeah, and it wasn't even careful editing. It's actually how Helen is. So when you hear this, you'll say, man, I bet you do like getting to work with her. And I'll say, yeah, I do. In fact, she's even fun if Staff Social is on Teams, or it's like Microsoft version of Zoom. If it's on there, she still shows up, and it's fun. Even though we aren't in the staff room throughout lockdown, we could still have a gin and tonic on Friday and commiserate through homeschooling. Anyway, Helen's great. I hope you enjoyed this. We're going to be doing a little fun interactive live stream later with Helen and a host of the other biblical scholars here at the school. But you'll hear more about that later. Before we hop into this conversation, I just want to remind you that there is an elect group of people, not election like, for eternal conscious torment or eternal bliss, but there's an elect group of people, those who are members of the Homebrewed community. That's right, the people that went to homebrewedcommunity.com, they got access to the private podcast feed for each level that gives them access to hundreds of other things, like, all our past classes popping up in your podcast feed. You get invited to a private Facebook group. We connect on social media, all sorts of little perks, but also the biggest one, what is this group of elect people do? They make a podcast like this possible. That's right. As a community of the elect, they donate each month, and it makes this project, this podcast, and all the resources here available, not just for them, but for the thousands and thousands of listeners. Because, there are a lot of ways to get access to thoughts about God on the internet. But most of them have a kind of flair. See, that's me being charitable. Anyway, I'm not going to be mean. I'm just going to say Homebrewed Christianity tries to bring scholars from a host of different disciplines and then interview them in ways that if I succeed, all the wisdom that is stuck in the ivory tower gets right into your earbuds, and you're able to think through your faith, your questions, your doubts, and, with some super nerds like Helen Bond. So if you want to be part of the elect, go to homebrewedcommunity.com and check out this amazing conversation with my friend Helen Bond. Enjoy. Hello, everyone. This is Trip, and today on the podcast is the head of school here at New College, the University of Edinburgh, Helen Bond. How are you doing, Helen?
I'm doing well, thank you. All things considered.
All things considered. And there's a lot of those things. So a lot of people that listen to the podcast won't have been in a country quite as aggressive during the lockdown process as Scotland.
Aggressive in what way?
The thoroughness of our lockdown. There was no halfway measures here.
No, and the worst thing is it's gone on for such a long time. I mean, we all thought we were coming out of lockdown before Christmas, and then we were straight back in there in January. And we've been pretty much in our houses full time since Christmas. I mean, we're only just now allowed to sort of meet up with other people and is it two households meeting up? I kind of get a bit lost on the rules, but I know basically we're supposed to stay at home.
Yeah. Yeah. I've found with some of our colleagues in the city, if we plan to get together, the ones that are American think, well, it's probably safe to do. If they're actually Scottish or German, they know the rules and let me know exactly what the boundaries are. And I'm like, oh, what? Like Ulrich, who's on staff, he's like, well, I can't come inside. I'm like, it's raining. So I had to set up a tent for us to sit outside. And I'm like, I don't understand.
We bought a tent for the garden too, though I have to say, we're too lazy to put it up. But
Well, maybe a good place to start is for you to tell a brief version of your origin story as a scholar of the New Testament. At what point in your life did you go, you know what? I want to be in the 0.001% of people that live, think, and write about the New Testament?
I'm not sure I ever made that decision, actually. I never started off thinking I'm going to be a lecturer, partly because I never saw any female lecturers. Lecturers, as far as I was concerned, was sort of old and doddery, the tweed jackets and things like that. And I also thought they were really clever, really clever. And I don't know, just sort of a bit esoteric, not quite in touch with reality. And I always felt fairly grounded, and I couldn't really imagine myself being a scholar. But when I went to St. Andrews to do my undergrad degree, I just got really, really fixed on biblical studies and New Testament particularly, and just the whole, from a historical point of view, really. I suppose I'm more of an ancient historian than anything else, but it's the origins of the Christian movement that really get me excited. And I felt by the time I got to my final exams, I felt like I'd just got the questions. I knew where the interesting questions were, but I still didn't have the answers. I don't know. I thought I'd do a PhD and then maybe move on from there, go and do a sensible job, like be a banker or an accountant or something. And then I just sort of got to the end of the PhD and thought, well, I could give an academic job a go. And I applied for a theological college, and I got the first job I went for. And I suppose it's just carried on like that. I suppose for a long time I thought, oh, well, probably time to get that sensible job. And then I realized that I'm probably way too old to get a sensible job now. And here I am. But I mean, I really love it. If I'd sat down with a game plan, this would have been, or probably it wouldn't have been. I can't imagine that my 12-year-old self would have thought what I'm doing now is a great job. But it combines all the things I really like, which are doing research. I love going to conferences, travel. I suppose I have a bit of a closet exhibitionist too. So I like lecturing. You sort of switch on that lecturing switch and give it wally. And I just like everything about it, really. I mean, there are some things like marking piles of stuff that aren't that great, but by and large, I like the variation as well. You're never doing the same thing 1 month on the next. So I think I just got really lucky.
Mm-hmm. Well, one of the things that happens in a lot of our fields, unlike certain other disciplines, is that there's already some familiarity with the figures and the text and the traditions that are coming up. And so, what are some of the assumptions or ideas that students regularly bring in that they go, oh, this is what we're talking about once you get to the New Testament? What are some of those regular rubs that show up that you notice that if people are more aware of, they might realize what's going on in the whole critical historical study of Scripture?
Well, I'm not so sure about students as much, but I mean, I think what you say is absolutely right in terms of sort of the general population. I did my PhD on Pontius Pilate, and I noticed that everybody has an opinion on Pontius Pilate. So you'd be in a taxi and they'd say, what are you doing? Oh, I'm writing a PhD on Pontius Pilate. And they'd have an opinion. I always feel sorry for Pontius Pilate, or he was the guy who did for Jesus. And after that, I've done stuff on the high priest Caiaphas, which people don't tend to know about so much. But I wrote a book on the historical Jesus. And again, everyone's got an opinion on Jesus, and 2 or 3 to spare. I mean, most people like Jesus, even people who aren't very keen on religion and organized religion and have plenty of negative things to say, nearly always they like Jesus. It's just the church that sort of went wrong after that. So yeah, I mean, I suppose I just happen to choose topics that are fairly mainstream and that people have opinions on. But I suppose most of what I've done has tended to be sort of characters. But I actually really enjoy hearing people's views of these characters, because, I mean, that's what it's all about in a way, isn't it? It's the reception of these and how your own situation alters the way that you sort of assess these characters.
Mm-hmm. So when you think of, I mean, even Pilate or Jesus, and so many of these characters, no one tells their story straight, right? Like when we encounter these figures from history, the people telling those stories, and this is something you explore in the book on Mark, looking at it and comparing it to ancient biographies, that when we tell these stories, ones that are memorable enough to last this long, there's always more than just a report going on. And I think that one of the challenges for engaging in New Testament studies and looking at the history of Second Temple period Judaism is that in the modern context, so much of the truth, right? Like I put scare quotes on it if you're listening, of those texts was defended by saying, oh, it's really objective history or whatever. And then you miss what the actual people you canonized are trying to accomplish. Can you kind of unpack how you see that tension and maybe some of the kind of modern assumptions about truth end up keeping us from wrestling and encountering these figures, these narratives, these stories?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And I think it goes down to what kind of literature you think this is. And I think so many people think the Gospels are historical reports. And to modern people, sort of post-Enlightenment, post-18th century, there's this idea that if something didn't happen, then it's made up, it's untruthful, it's not factual, and it's sort of a lesser degree. But what I've always thought and always tried to sort of defend is this idea that the Gospels and a lot of ancient literature too, it's not about historical reporting. Actually, I mean, I think the Gospels are biographies. And one of the great things about biographies is that they tend to be collections of anecdotes. And we all know of anecdotes that tell a story about when Professor so-and-so did X or Y. And you hear these stories and you think, well, maybe they're true, maybe they're not. But the point of telling them is that they sort of capture something really, really important about that person. So even if they never actually happened, it's the kind of thing. And it just grasps that central thing about what that person was like. I think a lot of the stories in the Gospels are similar kind of anecdotes. And in a way, it doesn't matter whether every single one happened or not. The main thing is, what is it telling us about this person? And it all belongs in a context where truth is something much huger than whether it actually happened. I mean, it's poetic truth, it's mythological truth, it's truth that can only be expressed through poetry and myth, and it's just a very different way of assessing the truth than we have nowadays. And I actually think that we've lost a lot. I mean, for me, I suppose a lot of this it comes down to your own personal way of understanding things and what you bring to these texts. But to me, poetry is so much more truthful than actual fact. I mean, a poem can really kind of express something really, really important that a piece of factual writing can't. And I think we need to sort of kind of claim that idea of texts being utterly truthful, being theologically truthful, being the most true way of expressing something. But it may not have actually happened, but that doesn't mean that it's any less truthful. And I think all of these first century texts are being written in that kind of an environment with that kind of idea, rather than this very prosaic pseudo-scientific idea that we have nowadays, that if something didn't happen, then we just think we can discount it. Oh, well, this didn't happen, so we tear that up and throw it away. That's just completely barking.
I mean, I think that's really important. And one of the things that strikes me is a bit that in the humanities, but also in religious traditions or spiritual practices, there is a kind of science envy because of the power of science and modernity, that then people that think like, oh, this is what truth is like when you get at it. But the truth of a love poem is not the same as a mathematical syllogism. And what if we like a world where they're both? right? And I think part of the problem of thinking that syllogistic truth is the supreme one, that it actually misses what animates humanity. Even what animates the search for science is awe, wonder, right? The challenge of figuring something out. It's not the actual equations. And I think to think that a lot of people wrestling with the big questions humans have asked around campfires forever today think that the solution is in equations just kind of sad, right? Like the right tools to get there.
Yeah, I agree completely. And I think a really good example of that is the empty tomb tradition. And you'll get a whole load of people who try to prove that the tomb was empty, and they'll bring all of these kind of scientific proofs and all sorts of digging away at the historical background. Would people have made up a story about women? All sorts of stuff like this. And they assume that because they've put up a good sort of historical defense of it, it's true. But that, again, just seems to be missing the whole point to me. The point is that it is mysterious. It's full of awe and wonder, and you just don't know. You have to respond in faith. And the whole idea about sort of digging around and trying to prove it, even if it were possible at 2,000 years remove, which I don't think it is, but the whole point is that this is picture language to express something that humans can't really grasp. And I'm happy with that. But I'm very much aware that there are people who aren't, and people who feel that they have to nail it down. And I do find that more difficult to understand.
And I run into it, like even this past semester teaching philosophy of religion. Some parts of philosophy do things analytically and are getting these fine-tuned arguments that they think, well, look, I've dealt with all the objections, so obviously the ontological argument works, right? What's it like to believe in God? And then there are other sides of philosophical traditions that are much more like what we're discussing, where the poetics of the tradition is not something you get at with an epistemology of distance, right? Like science has this distancing act. It's actually a participatory one. And that's one of the things I was really struck by in the Mark book, is that by looking at the Gospel of Mark as a biography, comparing it to other biographies, you even emphasize the way that Mark works backwards from the passion narrative and death, that the Gospel of Mark, by understanding the literary genre, it then becomes an invitation for the one who identifies Jesus as the Christ to learn to imitate Christ, to think about how it shapes one's life in ways that, if you're just arguing about its historicity compared to the other four gospels, you're going to be distracted that he dies on a different day in John. And there's so many of those like surface level things you miss out on. How do you give that invitation, say to like, what is the invitation of Mark to one that reads it, attending to the poetic depths and such that the genre of biography makes possible?
Well, it's exactly what you said, and well done, well done for reading it so thoroughly. That's exactly, I think, what Mark's invitation is. I think Mark is extending what it means, what the word gospel means. So, gospel is no longer just the proclamation of Jesus's death and resurrection, but it's gospel is living your life in the way that Jesus did. And so he presents Jesus's life as a model for those who call themselves Christians, the people who want to model their lives on him and live as he did. And so the idea is that you watch Jesus, you see how he lives his life, you see the virtues, which is a big thing. I mean, ancient biography is all about morality and how you live and sort of showing you a virtuous way of life. And so you model yourself on that, even though a lot of the time for Mark, he's actually sort of twisting the contemporary values of his own world upside down. So all that makes for honor is actually subverted in terms of saying that Christ followers really ought to be living as a shameful life in some ways. I mean, there's still things that everyone would accept. You've got to be compassionate, you've got to be moderate, you've got to look after others and speak boldly and all of these things. But when it comes down to it, you have to deny yourself and you have to put yourself last. And that, I think, is the essence of being a Christian for Mark. And yes, exactly. I think he worked backwards. I think he's wrestling with the whole thing about the crucifixion. What does the crucifixion tell us about Jesus's character? It's not just the cross resurrection event, but if you want to make this into biography, what does the cross tell you about Jesus's character? And I think the whole sort of idea of self-denial and being a servant to others sort of comes out from that.
Mm-hmm. So one of the things that I found really helpful in the book is the way in which you look at essentially the passion narrative in Mark as half the book of Mark, right? Like the passion narrative takes up so much, but you set it alongside the way other quote good deaths were shaped in ancient literature, say like the philosopher, like think of how Plato tells Socrates' death and such like that. Could you kind of unpack what the good death looks like in general, and then what we know with the introduction of the cross? Because I think that there are places that you draw parallels where you can see Jesus connecting with the good death of like a wise teacher and such, but also the role of the cross in Roman political system, but also the way it's seen in Second Temple period Judaism adds this other element.
Yeah, well, Socrates is, of course, the epitome of the good death. So it's a very calm death. It's when you accept your death, you are probably going to be courageous, you face it head on. I mean, the converse is that you're weeping, you're feminized, you're running away, you're doing everything you can to avoid death. But in the good death, I mean, it might be on the battlefield, but in terms of a teacher or philosopher like Socrates, it's something about knowing when your hour is up. And I found that very interesting, actually, that a lot of philosophers talk about knowing the hour of their death was upon them. I mean, that's all over the Gospels, isn't it? That is that courage. It's that sense that there's a purpose, a plan sometimes. This is the hour of my death. I'm going to calmly accept it. Usually you have friends, family around. You sort of make your peace with everybody and you sort of calmly drift away. And that's very much the way that Plato describes the death of Socrates in the Phaedo. But what I found really interesting about that, actually, was that I came across an article by Christopher Gill in which he was talking about what hemlock poisoning is actually like. And it's hideous. I mean, it's not this sort of tranquil laying yourself down and drifting away as Plato describes, but it's a hideous death. And I suppose that made me realize that the difference between a good death and a bad death is simply the way it's told. And sometimes you only need a few details to change a good death to a bad death. A bit of sniveling, a bit of running away, take your friends away, and suddenly you're starting to get a bad death rather than a good death. So I started being really interested in the way that people talk about death. And I also found out that in Diogenes Laertius, who's a 3rd century sort of compiler of lots of philosophical lives, he often, when he's talking about a philosopher, he often says, there are numerous versions of his death going the rounds. There's this version and that version, and then there's this other version. And he just sort of lays them side by side. I mean, most biographers would probably choose one of those. But what I found interesting about that was the chances are that friends create a sort of a good death. Enemies may well have created a less good death, add a bit of sniveling, add something ridiculous. He fell out of a chariot and broke a leg and then he just died. And so again, it just reinforces the idea that it's the way you tell the story that matters. I think Mark clearly had his work cut out because of all the deaths in the ancient world, crucifixion was the worst, or certainly up there amongst the worst. And it was so bad that Romans didn't even talk about it. It's just the punishment of slaves. It's something so far beneath them that they're not even going to talk about it. So I think to do any kind of redeeming of a death like that is quite difficult. Luke and John certainly have a bit of a go at redeeming it. But I think in Mark's case, he simply faced it head on. He knew this was a terrible death. But the way he sort of redeems it is by saying it's perfectly in keeping with Jesus's teaching. So Jesus is this philosopher who teaches that you have to deny yourself, you have to be like a servant, and then he dies a servant's death. And I think it's clear from the narrative that Jesus is not servile by temperament. he, in many ways, he's quite an elite male. He engages in debate with opponents, and he's always emerges best, and he's a great benefactor. He feeds all those people. There's lots of very positive stories about him. But then when his hour comes, he denies himself and he dies this servant's death, perfectly in keeping with his teaching. And I think that is a way of redeeming his death for Mark, because there's a very strong sense in biographies of philosophers that a philosopher should die in keeping with his teaching. And that's exactly what Jesus does. Like I say, I don't think Luke and John were altogether happy with what Mark put together. And both of them try to kind of redeem the death in their own way. And John, of course, kind of gives it this glorious thing. He's lifted up in glory on the cross. But I don't think Mark's is a bad strategy. And I think it has a lot more going for it than people often realize.
I really liked it. I wonder, how do you see then the cry of dereliction functioning in Mark? Because like you mentioned, John, Jesus basically from the beginning of the gospel is like, I am the incarnate Logos. And like when they go to arrest him, they're like, where's Jesus? He's like, I am. And they just fall over, like let everyone know the Logos is in the house. And so it's like, it is finished, head nod, cosmic victory, that kind of thing. And there seems in Matthew and Luke both picking up on the Psalm, right, that Jesus is quoting, but also expanding it to sanitize, in a sense, the cry of dereliction standing on its own. How does the thinking through in comparison to other biographies and how a good death matches the teaching, how's that frame looking at the cry of dereliction?
Yeah, well, I think the cry of dereliction is sort of doing two things. I mean, on one level, Mark wants to say Jesus's death accomplishes something. I mean, Mark is not, he's not a systematic theologian, so it's not all that clear, but Jesus's death is some kind of a ransom for others, and it's some kind of establishment of a new covenant with God. So taking place at Passover, it's a kind of a new covenant. So on one level, I think it's really important to Mark that Jesus does go to the cross alone, because he is going to do something that nobody else can possibly do. But once he's done that, then there's this big invitation to other people to follow him, even to a horrible end, if that's what has to happen. So at the same time, I think there is this sort of level of imitation there. But I think the cry of dereliction shows that Jesus does go to the very end. This is what it looks like if somebody denies themselves completely and utterly. This is as low as it gets. Even apparently God himself has forsaken Jesus. I mean, soon enough we find out that God hasn't, because the temple veil gets sort of torn in half and we realize that God is still there. But for a moment, it looks as though he's not. And then you get all the language of the Psalms there. And this is the pits as far as Mark and his audience would have understood it. I mean, Jesus is at the very lowest possible ebb. And I think people do try to read this cry of dereliction and say, well, actually, the Psalm ends happily, and that's what Jesus was actually talking about. I don't think that's right at all. I think this is as low as it gets. And this is Jesus completely and utterly being like a slave. And I think that's an important thing for Mark.
I mean, thinking about what you said earlier about the kind of truth, a biography, right? About especially one you call Lord, which the evangelist that wrote it and the community that it circulates to did. One of the powerful things when you look at it literarily is that, in a sense, saying like in the very heart of God is the experience of being forsaken and being faithful, even if you no longer use the word Abba and you're on the cross, you're like, my God, why have you forsaken me? That in the absence of the experience of intimacy and all these types of things you see through the gospel happening, that he was faithful all the way to the end and without reserve, even when there wasn't like kind of the support structure of the Spirit. That's beautiful. And then that life is in the heart of God is a kind of a theological narrative of saying that the divine, the great mystery of existence, has forsakenness in it, and that suffering and death in it. These things that in the honor shame culture that you emphasize throughout the book that God has taken sides in a sense through Christ with the underside and the exploited. And that's too beautiful to then get rid of it by saying, wow, the psalmic quotes is just, I think that's a real powerful piece of Mark.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really nice way to think about it, especially thinking about desolation as being part of the heart of God. And I mean, I do resonate with this idea that, a lot of commentators have that Mark wrote for a community that was being persecuted in some way or other, whether that Nero's Rome or whatever it was. But there's so much in the gospel about persecution and trials and tribulations. And I think if you are somebody who knows people who've gone through some terrible experiences or are fearful that you might have to yourself, I think there's a lot in that picture that would have given people hope and reassurance, whatever the situation was like.
When in Mark, the transfiguration narrative involves this deliberate turning to Jerusalem. Can you say a bit about that? Because I find when you think of the intensity of the passion narrative, that Jesus deliberately turns towards Jerusalem, aware of what's going to go down, that the event of transfiguration is really helpful for transitioning from thinking about the nature of discipleship, what it means for Jesus to be the Christ, towards the passion.
Yeah, I mean, the transfiguration is a really interesting one because it just sort of sits there and it's such a different perspective on Jesus to what you're going to get. As you say, it's sort of at that central transitioning bit where Jesus has finished his ministry in Galilee and he's now on his way to Jerusalem. I think what the transfiguration is doing, Mark famously has no resurrection appearances, even though presumably he knew that such things existed, because, I mean, Paul talks about them in the 50s. In a way, it's a sort of a picture of Jesus's heavenly glory as Jesus's followers in Mark's present day know it to be. He's white and glowing and all the things that people think heavenly beings are like. And he's also shown with Elijah and Moses, who, according to sort of Jewish history, are the two people who haven't died, but they've gone straight up as well. And I mean, obviously great patriarchs and linked with the law and the prophets. But I think it's that element of being in heaven that's important about them for Mark. So I think this is Mark's way of saying, however bleak it's going to get, keep this image in your head, because this is who Jesus is. And you've had a similar thing, I think, all the way through the first half, where Jesus is constantly sort of downplaying things and saying, don't tell anyone, keep it secret, keep it secret. Yet you've got these unclean spirits who are running around the place saying, oh, the Holy One, the Mighty One. They're all busily telling everyone who Jesus is at the same time that he's keeping it quiet. So I think you sort of have this thing here in pictures with the transfiguration, where you see what Jesus is like in heavenly glory. And of course, the gospel ends with this sort of mysterious empty tomb. But what the disappearance of a body would have meant to a first century hearer was he's now in heaven. You can call that resurrection if you like, but for someone from a Greco-Roman background, the loss of the body means that he's up in heaven. And that's, of course, what Jesus has been saying all the way along. I'll be on the right hand of the Father, ready to come back again. So I think the transfiguration is to place that image really carefully in your mind, so you know as you're reading that this is who Jesus really is, no matter what happens going forward.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned in the book something I don't think I'd ever thought of. And then when you said it, I thought, why have I never even thought of this? It's that there's almost no details about Jesus, like his physical appearance. And or like, did he have family? There's not, all you get is like, my family are the ones that do the will of the Father, right? Like, what do you think's going on in that? When I read it, I was like, is there really? And there isn't. I went back and looked and I was like, well, Helen's correct. There isn't. But what's going on you think in the biography with so many details, like what you said as you died, but not, well, he had started to thin his hair up top and none of those elements.
It is strange because I was looking at sort of what people would expect to find in a biography, and physiognomics was very big at this time. So the sort of pseudoscience You could tell a person's character from what they looked like. And I mean, there's lots of biographers who sort of obviously think that that's a little bit pushing it and sort of stand a bit light to that whole tradition. But still, normally you get to know. And you would expect, I think, given the sort of the scriptural background too, that we might be told he was tall and handsome and flashing eyes. We expect some kind of beauty in these figures. And the fact that there was nothing at all did strike me as strange. And then I noticed, actually, we're not told his age either. It's Luke who says he's about 30. So we're told nothing about what he looks like, what his age is. We even don't really have very much about gender. I mean, he is sort of presented as an elite male running around the country with these male disciples. But still, there's nothing about a family or children or any of those other things that would make him a sort of really grounded male. And I started to wonder why that was. And the standard answer is just, well, Mark's not very interested in that. And that might be true. It might be that Mark just isn't interested. But it also made me think a large part of what Mark is doing, I think, is presenting Jesus as a character to be imitated. And what a lot of people who write about biography say is that characters in biographies tend to be sort of a little bit rubbed out, because if you're presenting a character for other people to imitate, you don't want them to be too idiosyncratic. You want to be able to say a person like this would do this. And it did strike me that perhaps the reason why we don't have any of these specific details about what he looked like or his age or his gender is because it's something to do with the imitation. Almost anybody, young or old, male, female, whatever you're like, you can find something in that characterization of Jesus in the gospel that kind of includes you in a way. So I don't know, I'm not throwing that out as a definite thing, but it did strike me as a possible reason, even if it wasn't conscious with Mark, that there's that sort of subconscious presenting Jesus as the Son of God, but at another level, it's somebody that you can relate to and model your life on.
One of the things that came to my mind when I was thinking about it is so many of the images of the life of the early church and Paul are these participatory ones, right? You're baptized into Christ, you're the body of Christ, all these type of things. One way of telling that as a theological narrative would be something like what you're describing here in Mark, that yes, Jesus is revelatory and accomplishes these things and all this kind of stuff, but the figure also serves as an invitation for us all to conform our life to the pattern you see of Jesus's own fidelity to Abba. And you talk about in the book how both the disciples function and minor characters function throughout the text as a kind of narrative invitations to imitation in different ways. Can you describe that? Because I think once we put this kind of the biography as a thick theological narrative and not, oh, well, this happened, so I guess they're just reporting on it, then these other characters and the figures of the disciples become places to pause and think about our own way of being in the world.
Yeah, I mean, I think the figures of the disciples, the 12, are particularly interesting in all of this, because our natural way to read these texts is to side with the disciples, or at least to imagine that the disciples represent us in some way, because we're reading these texts with the whole sort of creedal structure of Jesus as Son of God, second member of the Trinity, and all of these things. And the idea of imitating Jesus is, I think, to some Christians, a strange one. I mean, to other people, what would Jesus do is sort of a natural thing, but to others, there has to be that sort of distance. And so the disciples seem to be the ones that we should be sort of modeling our response on. And then when you try to do that, I think you just get very muddled, because sometimes the disciples come off well, sometimes they come off really badly and they don't understand, and then they all run away at the end. So, what are you doing with that? Are you just saying, well, the disciples didn't manage very well, so you should try and be a bit better? Or, what's going on there? But I think if you read Mark as a biography, particularly a biography made up of different episodes, so that characters other than Jesus don't have a sort of a narrative arc across the episodes, but you're just looking at each episode and saying, what does this episode tell us about Jesus? What does this one tell us about Jesus? What does this one tell us about Jesus? Then you're not trying to link up the various pictures of the disciples and sort of present a sort of a characterization of the disciples, but you're asking, how do they function as foils to Jesus? And so it seemed to me that there's sort of a threefold thing in the gospel. In the early chapters, the disciples are doing a good job, and there they sort of represent the community that grows around Jesus that will later represent the church. And then in the middle section, they're permanently asking questions. And that then sort of provides Jesus with a peg to continue his teaching, because his teaching is hard. I mean, it would have struck anybody as borderline crazy. I mean, he's turning upside down all these traditional expectations. So I don't think we should be too surprised that the disciples are constantly questioning and constantly uncertain. But again, the focus, I think, isn't on us being like the disciples, but hearing the teaching that the disciples' questions are allowing us to hear. And then in the third section, I think there's a good theological reason why they have to run away. As we said before, Jesus has to go to the cross alone, because only he can be this ransom and establish a new covenant, and only he can go to the depths that he goes to in all of this. So I think the disciples sort of perform various narrative functions as you go along, but what they all have in common is that in each episode they are pointing to something in Jesus. And that's not to say that the disciples themselves don't embody certain values or sometimes things that you're supposed to avoid, like particularly denying Jesus and betraying Jesus. But I think the focus throughout has to be on Jesus rather than these other characters. And I think as soon as you start asking about other characters instead of Jesus, you're sort of missing the point.
No, that's really helpful. Why does Jesus use the title Son of Man as the most dominant one in Mark? Like, when you think of it as a biography, what's going on with the adoption of Son of Man language?
Yeah, well, I found that very interesting. I mean, ever since first year New Testament, I've always had lectures and stuff on the Son of Man and trying to get my head around what it was all about. I mean, I do think on a historical level, Jesus probably used that title, and that's probably, or a title, or at least called himself the Son of Man. And that's probably how it comes into the tradition. But what I was more interested in, the more you think of Mark as a biographer, the more you think of him as a literary author and someone who has choices. He can use it, he doesn't have to use it, it's up to him. When you look at the literary use of Son of Man in Mark's Gospel, I think then it becomes clear that Jesus is using it as a kind of a term of modesty. And I think Elizabeth Struthers Malbon has a great book about Jesus, and she had some similar things to say about the Messianic secret. I think not so much Son of Man, but I think it holds true for Son of Man too. In a way, if Jesus goes around saying, well, basically what he does in John, I'm the Logos, I'm the Son, I'm one with God, then it's very difficult to have him sort of denying himself, being like a servant. I think for Mark, Jesus is this much more modest, enigmatic character who doesn't claim any titles. I think for Mark, Jesus is saying, I am nothing but a Son of Man, nothing but a human one, a person. That's all I've got. I mean, of course, the hearer who knows Daniel hears other things there. And Mark does very much draw on the Danielic imagery when it comes to Jesus standing in front of the high priest, and you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand and coming on the clouds and all of that. And so even if you hadn't picked up on any Danielic imagery before, suddenly you might think, oh, yeah, there is something like that in Daniel. So I think it sort of does both for Mark, but predominantly, I think it goes together with the secrecy, and that it's a way of kind of dampening things down. So Jesus is not somebody who makes extravagant claims and has clients, and he's not somebody who's sort of held up by the people he meets. His whole thing all the time is to sort of reduce people's enthusiasm around him.
That's great. So I have a couple fun questions that I wanted to ask you, because you've also written on Jesus in films. And people watching Jesus movies with scholars is its own joy. So I was hoping to get your power rankings, your power rankings on Jesus films. Now,
okay,
it's like sports talk radio gives power rankings, like, the top 5 quarterbacks or whatever. But when you think of Jesus films, not like they're historically accurate or whatever, but you get to show them. And when you start to discuss them and interact with them with others, you're like, as a teacher and a scholar of all this, like, I love these films because of the conversations they provoke.
Okay, well, top place has got to go to Monty Python, the Life of Brian. Yeah, I think that is so clever. And I mean, irreverent too. I mean, there's no doubt about that, but just very clever the way it interacts with what we know about first century Israel. And yeah, I mean, there's just lots of clever things about it.
And a lot of memorable lines. Like,
yeah, exactly. I mean, I can never hear the word Spartacus without thinking I'm Spartacus and so is my wife, or the cheesemakers.
The cheesemakers. And the Holy Gourd is a high quality moment. And the collection of all the apocalyptic preachers.
Exactly. I used to like Zeffirelli's Jesus of Nazareth, though I have to say I watched it a few years ago and I did find it very, very slow. I think that's one of the problems, that anything that's not too up to date tends to kind of to date quite quickly. If I'm allowed a sort of a tangential one, I would go for the fairly recent Mary Magdalene film. You do get to see Jesus in that, even though the focus is on Mary, because I think that's really clever, actually sort of telling the women's story there.
As someone who wrote a book on Pilate, it is Pilate in The Last Temptation of Christ has to be like peak Pilate scene. Is that how?
Yeah, that's good. Or actually, what's really good too is Master and Margarita. There's been a Russian writer who kind of interleaved pictures of Moscow with sort of you go back and you're with Pilate, and it's all about people washing their hands and refusing to be complicit in decisions and what's happening around them. So that's really good portrait of Pilate. Oh, I don't know what else has been. I think there's more that I don't like probably than I do. Mel Gibson's with all the violence and the anti-Semitism. I'm not big on that.
Yeah, anti-Semitism for a Jesus film really downgrades it on the power ranking scale.
Yeah, it's difficult though, because I think the more accurate you are towards, and again, it goes back to that thing about being accurate to the gospel. When you actually see some of the things in the gospels replayed as drama in front of you, you think, whoa, wow, that's quite bad. Oh, I don't know.
What about Jesus of Montreal? That's one of my favorites.
I've never seen it. I've seen a part of it, and I have to say I got a bit bored.
Oh no.
I know. Really bad. I think I was expecting it to be more obviously about the Jesus story than it was, and it wasn't really. Oh, what else is? I mean, some of those old ones, King of Kings, I think are pretty bad. I wouldn't really want to watch that. Oh, Jesus Christ Superstar, actually, I'd put that up there too. I think that's obviously it depends on who's doing it, but I think it's a clever reworking, and the Herod Antipas bit is always pretty good.
Yeah. So when you think of the difference between, or maybe the difference between the quest for the historical Jesus task and then the interpretive task of wrestling with any one of the Gospels, say Mark, Matthew, Luke, John, or the non-canonical ones, what role does all the work that's gone into historical Jesus studies do for someone wanting to get at the narrative richness of the gospel?
Probably not very much. Well, yeah, a bit. I mean, I think I actually came onto the book about Mark through historical Jesus stuff, because my previous book had been a guide for the perplexed on the historical Jesus, and that was about 80,000 words. And then I wrote a shorter one, and I just felt like my books on Jesus are getting significantly shorter. I think like the next one's about 20,000 words. And did strike me, although I really like the quest for the historical Jesus. I like maths as a kid, and I like logic problems, and I like that sort of historical making sense of stuff, and that really appeals to me. But I kept thinking, so much of historical Jesus is basically Mark's Jesus. Everyone just says, well, we've got these 4 interpretations. Mark is the earliest. Let's go with Mark. And they keep doing that. And so in the end, Jesus is Mark's Jesus. But so it made me think, well, I really need to understand more about Mark and what is Mark doing? What kind of literature is Mark? So that's really why I sort of started to think, well, what does it mean to be a biography, and what does that tell us? So, yeah, I think to some extent, doing this book on Mark was a growing sense of unease with the historical Jesus enterprise. I think where it's been really useful for me is that I do know a lot about the debates that happen, and I have, I think, a broad sense of what's likely to be in the tradition, what's likely to have come from Jesus. And I think that's always kind of a useful string to your bow. But yes, I don't really think I don't know. I don't think I'll be doing much more historical Jesus. I think I am far more interested, or at least I'm interested in exactly the same amount in how people tell their story. So it's, as we were saying before, it's not just about trying to get to the factuality of it all, but it's how you tell that story. And that's actually, I think, ultimately more interesting than trying to work out what actually happened.
Mm-hmm. So, one of the things that I remember was in 5th grade. So like, I don't know, P6 or something like here. I was a Baptist minister's kid. So I didn't know people could go to bed without reading the Bible every day. And it was getting near Easter. And I read the passion stories of all 4 gospels and charted them out because, again, Baptists make charts with Bible verses on it. But this wasn't for foreign policy. So that was always good. And I called my parents into the room and was like, Mom, Dad, my Bible's broken. And I'm like lining up the detail. He doesn't die on the same day. Like John was not really worried. Mark, very. And there's tons of different details, all the way to like the triumphal entry and the cleansing of the temple, and John's all the way at the beginning. And I'm like, what is this? And I just remember after that asking like, well, was my Bible broken? There? Nope, that's how they are. And I find that there's a greater spectrum of voices canonized than often even churches will permit in them, right? Like if you were to think of Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Mark, or Paul's Christologies, or how they understand the faith, there's a huge amount of diversity. And yet the legacy of those texts are always read through your particular tradition's kind of theological closure, that a lot of people of faith are walking around with text, but their interpretive grid is an ecclesiastical gathering or whatever. And I wonder if, I don't know, what does it look like to really move beyond that? And how problematic is that interpretive inheritance for really seeing the treasures that are in these texts?
I mean, I think you're right. And I think the whole interpretive tradition of the church has been to say we have 4 texts, but one story, and to emphasize the similarities rather than differences. And of course, I mean, that's what biblical scholars have done for the last couple of 100 years, underscore the differences between them. But I think to go back to our earlier conversation, I think there are interpretative riches here in seeing the differences between the accounts, and actually poetic and sort of imaginative payoffs by doing that. But it's also very dangerous, because I think the more you say to people, actually, Mark's gospel is quite different to John or to Luke, or the more you point out any of these differences, people will immediately not hear what you're saying, and they'll just say, oh, so the gospels are wrong. They're pulling in different directions. They're not truthful, and the whole thing about them not being reliable. And again, it just goes back to not understanding what the gospels are supposed to be and what they're about. But I think you have to be really careful in doing that, because the more you stress the differences, the more people will not embrace them, but actually reject the whole gospels. And that then leads to a really difficult situation, because you're sort of trying to underplay the differences, while at the same time it's actually the differences that are a great treasure trove. And also, I think, encourage people to continue to tell the story in ways that reflect their own situation. I mean, that's exactly what Matthew did and Luke did and then John did. They're all retelling the old story in their own way. And think that very much behind people doing that again today, carrying on. And that's why I quite like films and things, because again, I think they're taking the story and they're telling it in a way that has contemporary relevance, and that's all good. But you do have to get past that really problematic thing that people think any kind of difference, particularly when you think these people generally think these are eyewitnesses. And if these are eyewitnesses and they're all telling a different story, then we can't believe any of them. And that's a really problematic thing.
Yeah, that's why I always try to emphasize, like, no, there weren't dumb people that canonized these, right? Like they knew. And so then what do you do with it? And I think it's important to emphasize that, especially today, now that we don't keep all questions and critical thinking for clergy in a monastery or just in the academy. If we canonize a multiplicity of testimonies, then it might give us more permission to acknowledge all the different ways people hold or cling on to whatever they call faith, right, in our congregations and in culture, who, like you mentioned earlier, like everyone likes Jesus, they aren't sure about the church and these type of things. But one of the brilliant parts of the tradition is saying yes to contradictory things on the surface. Then we might be able to say yes to a greater diversity of expressions in our own spiritual and religious lives, and recognize that the affirmation of multiplicity is a vital part of our tradition, as opposed to requiring canonical and confessional sameness. Because a lot of people will have allies in Mark's Christology. Jesus dies not really sure about his dad. And that's canonized. And I know so many people that's as close as they'll ever get. But if you tell them they all got to sound like they were marching around with a collar at Constantinople, then anyway, sorry for ranting at you.
I always joke with people that I like the Gospels, but not so much Paul. And it's not that I don't like Paul, it's that I don't like what a lot of modern scholars do with Paul. The whole thing about Paul is trying to work out a systematic way of understanding Paul's theology and trying to work out exactly what it is that he's saying. And what for me is much more interesting and exciting about Paul is seeing this at the very beginning of this sort of Christian movement and Paul responding to different situations. And he might emphasize one thing in one place and a completely different thing somewhere else. But it's that idea that it is still sort of very much being thought through and being alive rather than being sort of crystallized. That, again, I find that by far the most interesting thing about Paul. Once you start kind of working out systematic theologies of Paul, I'm kind of sleeping.
Well, don't worry, Helen. There are plenty of people who'll do it for you, and you don't ever have to do it.
Oh, I know. That's why I don't have to.
How does the thinking of the Gospels in the framework of biography change the way you read the opening narratives, be it John's prologue or the two birth narratives in Matthew and Luke, and then Mark's, the baptism and temptation scene? Does the biography framework give you a different lens for looking through those kind of the origin stories in the Gospels?
I don't think so particularly, although, I think they very much sort of conform to it. Not all biographies have accounts of the birth. That's a lot do, but by no means all. And particularly when you're talking about a philosopher, it's different in the case of a king or somebody like that. But for a philosopher, you don't necessarily get anything on their birth. And so I think it's where Mark starts. I think the baptism scene is an adoption. So that's the obvious place for him to start. You and Luke, though, obviously they don't like the idea that there ever was a time when Jesus was on earth, but he wasn't the Son. And so they sort of move that Christological moment earlier. And so therefore they construct these rather elaborate birth stories that, again, are perfectly in keeping with the kind of thing you get in the Old Testament. There's sort of the birth of the person who's favored by God, or also in Greco-Roman biographies too. And then John does sort of his own thing. Again, he's pushing back that Christological moment. It's not just that there was never a time when Jesus was on earth that he wasn't the Son, but there was never a time when Jesus wasn't the Son. And so he takes it right back then. I don't think there's anything quite like that in any of the biographies that I've read. But again, it's not a million miles away from what somebody who's thought very carefully about his Jewish scriptures and particularly the wisdom literature might want to say about Jesus.
Yeah, I think that the difference between them, it at least sets up, if you're wanting to attend to that individual evangelist kind of theological testimony, it directs your attention. And I think in your book, you emphasize the way the baptism and adoption element of Jesus as the Son, frames his ministry, which then goes right into the passion. But in Matthew and Luke, it's obviously doing different echoes to bring in different things, and John going all the way back. But the adoption line, do you think the traditions or whatever Chalcedonian Christology came to dominate things so much that it in a sense muted the Christological vision in Mark that you see through the adoption and baptism?
Yeah, very much so. And I think, considering what we've just been talking about, Mark asks you to believe far less than any of the others do. I mean, for Mark, Jesus is presumably sort of a fairly normal guy until he has this experience at the Jordan. So you get a lot of commentators who will just sort of say, well, Mark clearly was not an adoptionist, ! As if Mark had any idea of a later heresy that would be called adoptionist, and as if he had any idea that, there would later be Matthew and Luke who would push things further back, and then John. I mean, I think from Mark's point of view, he probably thought he was giving Jesus quite a high Christology. He's adopted by God at this sort of phenomenal life-changing moment and infused with the Spirit. So, yeah, I don't think you can hold Mark to account to later creeds or later heresies. I don't think it's appropriate to say Mark was an adoptionist. I think that's where his thinking was. But again, I think that is a model of how people might want to think about Jesus, and perhaps a more realistic human kind of model than John's model of Jesus.
I mean, even if you think of Paul, I know people argue about it, but in some sense, it sounds like in Romans that it's the resurrection of Jesus having been fully faithful as one in the line of David, that the resurrection through the Spirit into the life of God. And so if you're just thinking of those passages like in Romans as the other live options, Mark's higher in a sense. Right? Like he goes, no. It wasn't that we went all the way to the end and then gets resurrected. And it was his particular vocation. And so the whole vocation is a revelation of the nature and character of God and the invitation to discipleship and imitation and such.
Yeah, exactly. And Paul, of course, famously has hardly anything to say about Jesus's life. I mean, Paul is just not very interested in Jesus's life. He doesn't really seem to think that it has much bearing on Christ followers in his own day. Whereas I think Mark is making a substantial move from that to say, actually, the life of Jesus does matter. And I'm taking it all the way back to the beginning of the ministry. And that's quite a novel departure. I mean, whether Mark was the first to think of that or whether it was a development that was already underway and he just happened to write the best of these early biographies, we don't know. But it's certainly a movement, but still quite an audacious one. And to say that the life of Jesus matters and to attempt to piece it together, I think is quite a big undertaking.
Okay, so the last question is, let's imagine a movie studio comes to you and it's like, Helen, look, we want to do a movie around Jesus. We want it not to suck. And we don't want to pitch it towards one particular religious audience or whatever, but we want to introduce people through a film to a particular part of Jesus's life or an image of Jesus. Like what's your Jesus movie pitch?
Oh, what? So I can have any particular bit, and who am I having playing Jesus, or is that part?
Oh, if you can go ahead and get to casting, or even
yeah. I'm moving. Well, I think casting is going to be the important thing again, because I think the central thing of biography is the character, and it's that invitation to model your life on the character. So the character is going to be the most important thing. I'd want somebody who was clearly very Jewish looking, none of these blonde-haired, blue-eyed Jesuses. And again, to go back to that earlier conversation, I'd want somebody who could be almost any age, who sort of in touch with his feminine side, perhaps. I suppose for me, it's always going to be about the passion narrative. I think the bit and the trial scenes, because I just think they are so dramatic. And there's a sort of parallelism between the trial scenes that when we do the usual sort of harmonized thing and we get a bit of John in there and we sort of miss. But I think something that really brought out the parallels between the Jewish trial scene and the Roman trial scene and had Jesus as that indefinite hero figure, I think would be really powerful.
So who are you going to cast? Now I want to know.
I'm really hopeless at knowing what actors are called. I don't particularly mind I guess it's got to be a man, but as long as he's sort of fairly dark and actually I think an unknown. I wouldn't actually want somebody who was known for all the other roles that they play. That's always the problem, I think, when you get somebody who's well known. He's known for everything else he's done. So I would go for somebody who hasn't done anything before, perhaps.
Mm-hmm. If you were doing the Passion Week narrative, you could even have Pilate be the center character, and you get the interaction, like you get to learn about the festivals going on, being there, interact with Herod and company, and that kind of thing.
Barabbas, I mean, one of the interesting things about the trial scene is that you've got that interaction in the Jewish scene between Jesus and Peter. Peter's denying everything, Jesus is accepting everything. And then in the Roman trial scene, you've got the sort of implicit contrast between Jesus, the so-called king, and Barabbas, the bandit leader who's in prison with others who've murdered and been in the insurrection. And I think you could have some really interesting interplays between Barabbas's idea of kingship and Jesus's idea of kingship.
See, that's what I'm talking about. Now, if if you're listening and you're a movie executive, Helen's at the University of Edinburgh, ready to
unavailable, very cheap rates.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for hanging out on the podcast.
That's been good. Really nice to talk to you, Trip.
Awesome. Whoa. You made it all the way through this episode. That's awesome, because I enjoyed it. And it's always fun when you listen to the end of an episode, and it was one that I recorded with someone I really like Helen, and now I get to tell you a little secret. We are going to be doing a live stream in the near future with Helen and a host of the other biblical scholars here at the University of Edinburgh. And they're going to be tackling questions sent in by you, dear listeners. That's right. So be on the lookout. You're going to be getting some more information about this in the near future, including I'm working on a little page that has a short videos from a number of different biblical scholars introducing you to their different research interests and stuff, because that might pique your interest. You may say, I want to ask a follow-up about that. I want to hear about that. But the big goal is to really see the frontiers of biblical scholarship that's taking place, and get to meet some of the cool Bible nerds that I hang out with here in Scotland. So be on the lookout. And remember, share the brew. That means this episode, share the brew. All right? Smoochy boochies.